Now, the next item on the agenda is Mrs. Hübner's and Mr. Leinen's report on the electoral reform of the European Union. I'll give them the floor in a few moments, but I would like to ask all of the new members who have appeared in the hemicycle to please keep their remarks brief because we're quite late. Mrs. Hübner will be the first speaker.
Thank you, Chair. We are here because we decided to amend European electoral law. This law comes from 1976, and in the meantime, as we all know, Europe has been through major unimaginable changes, both in terms of scope and substance of European integration. And also European Parliament has changed dramatically in terms of its size, but also regarding its competences, especially as co-legislators, with huge impact of its decisions on people's lives. And it should not come as a surprise that we want to adjust the Electoral Act of 1976 to the new reality. And this report highlights the right of European Parliament to decide upon its own electoral procedure. We all have very similar experience as European parliamentarians of elections to European Parliament, which continue to be extremely national. There are no European issues discussed during the electoral campaign. There is no visibility of European dimension of this democratic process. And that is why we propose a change to European Electoral Act of 1976. In the proposal, we give the European Parliament the right to decide on the date of the election. We ask Member States to ensure that all citizens working or living outside the European Union are granted the right and the possibility to vote. We also propose a machinery to avoid double voting. We are asking Member States to create conditions for elections through electronic means, through internet or by post. People with reduced mobility will certainly benefit. And I know that some colleagues worry about internet voting, but it can be made safe. We have an example of Estonia, who started the votes through internet in 2005, where 2% of Estonians decided to use this instrument. This year, 30% of Estonians voted through internet. We want also to see more gender equality on the list. We propose also alignments of deadlines for some elements of electoral process, like establishing the electoral list. Let me also mention the possibility for national parties to inform the voters through the ballot paper about their affiliation with European political parties. Citizens should know this. Through those and other actions, we hope to contribute to making elections to European Parliament truly European ones and increase interest of citizens in participating in this important element of European decision making. Let me conclude by saying that the impact of people on Europe starts with their informed participation in the elections. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you. Mr. Leinen.
Ja, Frau Präsidentin.
Yes, President, Commissioner, colleagues. The European Parliament is a unique phenomenon worldwide. Nowhere else do people enjoy the possibility of electing a representative chamber from 28 countries. Only in the European Union does that occur, and we know that these elections covering 28 countries do create a number of problems. Although we've already had rounds of European elections, not a great deal has yet been done to tackle the shortcomings that we've noticed in the elections. That's where we're making an attempt to come forward with proposals for the next European elections, 2019, to make them more transparent, more democratic, and also to make them more European. And Ms. Hübner has said that we are coming up with recommendations to the Member States, and we wish to see a change to the 1976 Electoral Act. With the recommendations, the aim is to ensure a greater accessibility of European elections. We want to attract younger generations to take part in the elections. A lot of young people will now be able to cast their vote in European elections at the age of 16. And that's going the outcome of those elections will affect their lives for a very long time. Now, Austria has reduced voting age to 16, and I think that the younger generation, the internet generation, are keener to use their mouse or trackpad to register their vote than join a queue in front of the town hall or the polling station. And I think the thorough preparation of European elections is another subject. We've noted that in some countries the electoral roll is finalised only 17 days before the election. We're saying now that should happen at least 12 weeks in advance, and you can have 3 months of campaigning in the large constituencies we all represent. And we often find that there are national debates and the national issues on debated on TV tend to overshadow the European content of the elections. And so we would like to ensure that the ballot paper shows not just the name of the political party, but the European political group to which that party belongs. And we think that it's, again, important for that allegiance to be determined at least 12 weeks before the elections. We think that we ought to get a 50-50 gender balance. Many countries do this already. Why shouldn't others engage in that? Perhaps 2019 might seem a little early for some. We think that it's certainly achievable by 2024, and we want to ensure that there are indeed proper balances. We are suggesting that there is a cut-off ultimately of 5% for people to be elected. Many countries have a figure of 3% at present. And we also think that we need to have a thoroughgoing debate on this. Attempts to improve the situation have not prospered hitherto. I hope that this will. Thank you.
Gericke, est-ce que j'ai bien compris?
Mr. Gericke, can I
Vous demandez un temps de carte bleue à Monsieur Leinen.
Do you wish to speak to a point made by Mr. Leinen? Mr. Leinen, do you accept the card?
Allez-y, Monsieur. Ce n'est pas très usuel.
This is rather an unorthodox procedure.
Herr Leinen, kennen Sie diese beiden?
Mr. Leinen, are you aware of these two analyses of European electoral law? I think you're old enough to recognise this. One dates from February, one from September. One involving Andrew Duff, and there are two of such opinions, one saying yes and one saying no. We've actually had two very expensive inquiries carried out, coming to absolutely opposite conclusions in a short space of time. President, Mr. Leinen.
Ja, lieber Kollege,
Yes, colleague. We have deliberated on this in AFCO on a number of occasions. We think that there ought to be equal opportunity in electoral terms in all 28 countries. In fact, in some countries it's possible to get a seat with 0.6% of the votes, whereas other countries you need 3% of the votes, all votes cast, to achieve that. That's not a balanced picture. And we indeed have a clear view on this, decided by a majority of AFCO. And we now hear from the Commission. Ms. CREșU.
Madame la Présidente, dear colleagues, dear...
Madam President, colleagues.
The founding value of the Union means that the EU institutions must exercise their powers according to the highest standards of representativeness and accountability. The Commission and the European Parliament share the same objective of strengthening the democratic legitimacy of the European Union. I congratulate the Parliament on the proposal for amending the rules for electing its members that is discussed today. The report voted in the AFCO committee on the basis of the proposal by Madam Danuta Hübner and Mr. Jo Leinen has the potential to become a milestone in the way democratic evolution of the European project, which, as we all know and we have to recognise, has been a remarkable but also long and very painful process. Ahead of the last European elections, the Commission, mindful of the strengthened role of the European Parliament in the appointment of the President of the Commission under the Lisbon Treaty, and echoing long-standing calls from the European Parliament, had prompted European political parties to nominate lead candidates for the function of President of the Commission. The European political families did so for the first time, and Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, as a candidate who was able to command a majority in the newly formed European Parliament, was nominated by the European Council and elected by the European Parliament as President of the Commission. This key novelty of the 2014 elections connected the elections of Commission President more directly to the choice of the voters. Consolidating this new element for future elections will reinforce the democratic legitimacy of the European decision-making process and will be a significant step forward fostering the emergence of a genuine European political sphere. The Commission supports the proposed reform, which will further strengthen political accountability, as European parties will have to nominate their lead candidates at the latest 12 weeks ahead of the elections. The reforms can also help bridge the divide between political processes at national and EU level, showcasing the affiliation between national and European political parties on ballot papers and in political broadcasts during the electoral campaign will make the links between the main actors involved more visible to voters and improve their trust in the process. And here I think we have been all victims of the lack of discussion and debates about European issues, and I think it's very important that I think national political parties and authorities have also a decisive role to play to help increase transparency, to make citizens more aware of the European repercussions of votes cast for national parties. Having further common principles in the organisation of the European Parliament elections, such as minimum threshold in all member states for allocation of the seats, also contributes to strengthening the European dimension of these elections. In substance, the establishment of such a minimum threshold will make the functioning of the European Parliament more efficient by decreasing the risk of fragmentation and facilitating stable majorities. We speak of a crisis of representative democracy, of the disillusions of people with politics. Promoting participation is essential for the progress of the European project. This is why I warmly welcome the proposals for extending the right to vote also to EU citizens living in third countries, and for putting in place a more flexible and inclusive way of casting votes, fostering political participation of women in Union decision-making and in European elections, using electoral lists that ensure gender balance, as proposed in the report, is another important step in the right direction. And I was also here, but on the other side, when I proposed so many times this quota, and from the country I know best, I think we should do something also on the national level, because, as I said, in many countries it's a catastrophe on local levels and also in the national parliaments. At least here we have this principle, and I think it's very important. Fair and objective media coverage during European election campaigns, of course, is another key element, and I wish to stress it since this is an essential condition for free and fair elections. I take note of your proposal to establish a European Electoral Authority, where information about the elections to the European Parliament will be centralised. Before any further commitment, this would need to be carefully and examined. And in particular, we need to examine the opportunity and feasibility of such a proposal, including the responsibilities of such an authority, the possible arrangements to establish it, as well as the related institutional, legal, budgetary and staffing needs for its functioning. The Commission, as I said, is fully supporting the Parliament's efforts to adopt these timely and ambitious proposals. Congratulations.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Commissioner. We will now begin hearing from the group speakers. Mr. Schöpflin, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner. There is nothing untoward in the European Parliament looking to establish a common system of election for itself. Every parliament in the world does so, and it adds to transparency and predictability if the system by which citizens choose their representatives in the EU are broadly similar, not identical, given that there are 28 different political traditions involved. The sensitive issue here is that of a threshold. Should there be a minimum percentage of votes that a party list has to attract before it acquires representation? In some member states, there is no support for this, but in the great majority, it is accepted practice. The threshold helps to weed out frivolous contestants whose sole interest is to attract attention. There is a counter-argument that the institution of the threshold restricts the political marketplace by creating too high a barrier to entry. The answer is a balance between the two. Have a threshold, but not set it too high. This is what this report tries to attain: set a threshold, but not to make that threshold insurmountable. From every standpoint, this is the sensible, rational solution.
Merci. Madame Bresso.
Thank you, Ms. Bresso. 1.5 minutes for the S&D.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank the rapporteur for all of the work that's been put in. It's been a complex job. And I'd also like to thank the Commissioner for all the support that she's given to our initiative. This is a very delicate topic. It's one of the cases in which the Parliament does have a right to legislative initiative. That's to say, more than simply small modifications to legislation. But for years now, the Council has been refusing to change the electoral law, because of course we would like to make these elections more European, as Mr. Schöpflin rightly recalled. These proposals move towards having a more homogeneous electoral law across the EU. I'll remind you of a few of those proposals. We're trying to give visibility to European political parties and give a European dimension to the elections, and also nominating the candidates for the President of the European Commission. We'd also like to ensure that enough weeks can be provided for those names to be made known. Gender balance is indispensable in my view, and the idea of transnational lists could at least be included in a recital, at least a small note at this point. I hope that we will manage for the first time to have a self-defined electoral law in this Parliament. Thank you.
Monsieur.
Thank you. Mr. Ujazdowski, 2 minutes, VCR.
Madam President, the ECR thinks that the current electoral law is quite correct, and we don't see the reason why it should be changed to centralize and harmonize electoral law at the European level. And I'd like to mention 2 things. First of all, if we lower the voting age to 16 years of age, or if we encourage elections on the internet, that these 2 measures will mean that more people will vote. We don't think so. We don't have to resort to the internet as the main means of voting. But what's more important is the question of centralizing electoral law and the obligation to use the European party logo together with national party logos. We don't see such necessity. There are new political parties in our member states that may choose to do that later when they enter the European Parliament. Why should we make them do it during the electoral campaign? But first of all, the legitimacy of the European Parliament should be based on respect for national traditions, for national sovereignty. The closer we are to the nation, the closer we are to the citizens. If we harmonize, centralize, then the European Parliament will get farther and farther away from the real problems of the citizens, and therefore we will be voting against this proposal.
Pour le groupe ADL pour 2 minutes.
ALDE for 2 minutes, Ms. Pagazaurtundúa.
Sí, Presidenta, muchas gracias.
Thank you, President. Just a few hours after this debate, the decision was taken to delay the vote to give us the chance to clarify some of the aspects addressed in this report, which might add to its import. I think so far the report has shown a signal lack of ambition. I think this really is a wonderful example of how we've missed a great opportunity. This comes at a time when the European institutions find themselves cast into discredit. Only 1 out of 4 people entitled to vote for the European Parliament. At the same time, this has implications at the national level. Governments back at home are playing a similar game. Major parties are out of step between what they say in the European Parliament and what they say back at home, especially when they're in government. Those recommendations which are designed to promote a greater awareness of Europe are something which we support. European elections should be something more than a test for national policies. The European Parliament should be the Parliament of the citizens, and we, the representatives of the citizens, should be subject to constant scrutiny. We should ask ourselves whether this report really does achieve those objectives in terms of the recommendations it comes forward with. It proposes certain positive changes, some of which are cosmetic in nature, others in which would have a real impact in our countries. It does propose certain improvements in terms of gender equality, for example, or voting rights in our countries. However, one proposal which would be to put the logos of political parties on voting slips is approved. However, we don't think that the idea of quotas is something which really we think reinforces the role of political parties.
Mr. Scholz, 1.5 minutes for the GUI.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner. Well, after the vote is always before the next vote, and European electoral law is certainly an important item on our agenda. But a lot can be done through electoral law. But the question is, who does this serve at the end of the day? Does it help us improve the public space in Europe, where there seems to be an increasing divide between politicians and citizens in Europe? To what extent? Will it encourage active political participation by those that have been excluded, including those excluded by gender inequality? The co-rapporteurs have good intentions here, but nevertheless, I think that we should be. They should have been much more courageous. They seem to be fettered to old concepts of politics. I think it would be more important to try and create new political spaces for people to become participants, rather than simply technically tinkering around the edges. This doesn't deal with the problems that we face inside the member states. Now, the report basically says that the interests of our citizens are the same as the Grand Coalition in Germany, and I think that is manifested by the threshold, which I think is a slap in the face of the German Constitutional Court.
Monsieur TERRICABRAS.
Mr. TERRICABRAS for the Greens on 1 minute.
President.
Thank you very much, Madam President.
The law of the European Union is a very important issue. The fact that it had two rapporteurs was a first signal of alliance in the leadership, not necessarily bad in itself, but it was also soon complemented with a certain amount of lack of flexibility when the debate came to the point of accepting or not some of the many suggestions and proposals brought up by other groups. In this sense, I very much regret to have to say that this is a weak reform which has not been able of encompassing the sense of history. Among many other things, the report should have insisted in proposals reinforcing the confidence of European citizens in their institutions, but it hasn't done so, at least in the following 4 areas. 1. The report establishes something new, namely an obligatory threshold, declared unacceptable by the German Constitutional Court and now introduced as obligatory for all countries in Europe. This measure clearly goes against the spirit of diversity and protection of minorities. 2. Transnational list. They have just been mentioned in passing, almost by chance, transformed in a mere recital. 3. Surprisingly enough, even the introduction of gender equality has been postponed till the European election in 2024, and we haven't established the minimum age of voters at 16. Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President.
James pour le FDD.
Ms. James, FDD, 1 minute.
I listened to the opening statements outlining the goals proposed and attempting to justify them, and quite frankly I was aghast to hear some of what I heard. There's a famous author called George Orwell, and he would have been proud of what was outlined this evening, and for those that are frightened by the contents of that book, their feelings would have been substantiated. More control of the electoral outcomes seems to be the goal. Even less democracy despite calls for such. Just look at what happened recently in Portugal in terms of the elections outcome there. Is the goal of more of what I've heard this evening and more of what is being outlined to ignore the will of the people and ignore what is a democratic electoral outcome? I've heard no account thus far of the scale of global cyber attacks or personal ID theft, and yet this whole focus on electronic voting and such. I'm going to finish by saying electoral law is a matter for sovereign nations, not for this chamber, for which that is alien. Thank you.
Monsieur Annemans pour 1 minute.
Mr. Annemans, 1 minute.
Verkiezingsakte van 1976.
Ladies and gentlemen, the formal electoral law from back in 1977 is fully sufficient to conduct elections in member states. The European Parliament now wants to adopt a new electoral law which will force the European electorate to vote en masse, but above all it will force voters to support this new EU while simply sidelining member states. Moreover, the EU legislation would take away many rights for member states. MPs would no longer represent their states but citizens of the whole European Union. At the same time, there would also be party lists for the elections. Compulsory voting would be introduced everywhere so as to avoid further fragmentation, enabling people to vote for small, primarily anti-European parties. We insist that parties should remain autonomous, and countries should be able to decide themselves what procedure will be used for their citizens.
Would you accept a blue card, a question from Ms. Bresso?
Allez-y, madame.
Go ahead, madam.
Sarò fulminante. Le ricordo che...
I'll keep it very brief. Well, this agreement is on the basis of the current treaties. We represent the whole Union, not our member states. Did you know that?
Madam, as to what's in the treaties, that's not why I'm elected. You can see the flags around me, and my hope is that more and more of these flags will sprout up in this chamber. We represent the voters who vote for us. We're entitled to do that. And you're also entitled to pretend you represent the whole of Europe, but that's simply not the case. We represent our voters, our people, and finally, Europe.
Mr.
Svoboda, 1.5 minutes.
Vážená paní předsedající, smlouva o fungování Evropy.
Thank you very much. Now, the Treaty on the Function of the EU provides the European Parliament with the possibility to initiate a reform of electoral law. I am glad that this has come about, that the AFCO committee has availed itself of this opportunity. The idea in this report, I think, deserves support. Consolidating the democratic basis of the EU is a sine qua non condition for a positive attitude towards the European elections and encouraging maximum participation and turnout. That will benefit the EU as a whole. The European Parliament is a democratic creature, and I think that the idea is to promote that democratic spirit as far as possible. And we, of course, have to deserve the confidence of our citizens. Mr. Silva Pereira next.
Obrigado. Thank you very much, President. Well, normally we spend all our time lamenting the old problem of the democratic deficit rather than talking about measures for improving our democracy. Well, that's not the case today. And that's why I'd like to congratulate our rapporteurs, LEINEN and Danuta HÜBNER, for the excellent report, which proposes a very realistic manner of improving the electoral law for European elections. This is one of the few areas where the European Parliament has legislative initiative, but we have the duty, and not only the right, to do everything possible to strengthen the European dimension of our democracy. We're taking an important step in associating the European elections with the candidacies for the European Commission President. It's time to go further. The ballot papers and the campaigning materials should give visibility to the European parties. We need to have the same principles for gender equality. We need to have the same deadlines for presenting lists and candidates. We need to have the same times for voting and the same opportunity to use electronic voting and postal voting. And we need to have a threshold saying that there needs to be a range of 3 to 5% for countries and constituencies of more than 26 members. Citizens need to know who they're voting for and for what. European democracy will be better as a result of this electoral law. Thank you.
Madam President, the German Federal Constitutional Court has declared the 5% threshold for European elections is unconstitutional, since this would prevent small parties joining the European Parliament. This is why the SPD, the Union and the Greens want to reintroduce the threshold. Up until now, they stressed that the work of small parties in this House has been damaged. That argument, however, has been rejected by the Constitutional Court in its ruling. Graf Lambsdorff from the FDP and other representatives of small parties don't seem to bother anybody else in this House. So I would call on the big parties to finally be honest with us. Their outdated arguments have been used to cheat us once again, and what they've tried to do is eliminate the competition. What they've tried to do now is to introduce a binding threshold in European law so as to circumvent the ruling of the Constitutional Court. That's disgraceful behavior.
Ms. Müller, 1 minute.
Hier soll mit einer großen
Now, a large majority of Parliament is now addressing the reform of European electoral law, although the principle of subsidiarity still remains. Now we are talking about Spain and Germany being the two countries affected by this 3% threshold. It seems to me that it's possible to dismantle the argument that failing to have this threshold supported would cripple the Parliament in its operations. I think that's been set aside by the court ruling in Germany. It's actually anti-democratic, in my opinion, and in fact I'm the person who had 1.6% in the votes in my country. I've had most votes of anyone here, 428,800, more than Malta altogether.
Vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for giving me the floor. Now, introducing a 3 or 5% threshold, as has already been mentioned, will only affect Germany and Spain. They are the only countries that have both more than 26 members and no current threshold. Well, what would that actually mean if we were to introduce a threshold? What about fairness to small countries? That's what you said, Mr. Leinen, but that makes no sense. 3% in Luxembourg means about 12,000 votes. 3% in Germany means 10 times more. Germany is already disadvantaged proportionally, and if you take that into account, we're talking about 30 times more. So is that democracy? Votes from the smaller parties will end up thus flowing to the bigger parties.
Madame Meijer.
Ms. Meijer, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Today we're facing the umpteenth attempt by the European Union to relay the totalitarian state. The European Union is growing and nations are losing their powers. That's another indication of the democratic deficit in Brussels. Just look at the figures on turnout for elections, the fact that nobody knows who the President of the European Commission is. This democratic deficit can't be solved by banning exit polls in member states, by reducing democracy in member states, by forcing one-man, one-woman lists and to have thresholds. What we should be asking ourselves, why no one cares about the European Union. Why is it only 42% of people vote for European elections? The fact is, the majority of so-called people's representatives in the European Parliament support these anti-democratic attempts. Madam President, elections for the European Parliament are actually elections for national representatives. In my case, I believe that we should be representing the people of the Netherlands. Those elections are held in the Netherlands and the outcome is in the Netherlands. President interrupts.
Mr. PREDA, 1 minute.
În primul rând să-i felicit pe Danuta Hübner.
Thank you. Well, to begin with, I wish to congratulate Danuta Hübner and Jo Leinen. This is the second attempt at reforming European electoral law. In the last Parliament, we realised it was very difficult to strike a trade-off between our ambition and feasibility. I think we're getting there with this report. And we're not just looking at trying to produce the sum of 28 different electoral procedures. I do think we should support the thrust of the proposals in the Hübner-Leinen report. And the thrust of this was endorsed by the AFCO committee. We want to see more Europe in European elections. And I think that's really vital for the democratic legitimacy of these elections. And I have always supported the idea of voting as of 16. And I think there should be standard procedures in appointing the candidates and determining the candidates, and we ought to have online voting as well. That will encourage more people to engage with European politics. And I hope that we will see the change we want.
Sí, señorías.
Honourable members, the first question I'd like to put to you, don't you think that 40 years down the road the time has come to change the electoral law? It was adopted in 1976. 40 years have gone by. Do you think Europe has changed in that time? I think it probably has. My second question, don't you think that those of us who are here should all be subject to the same rules and the same rights? We should have a harmonised system with an electoral law covering our elections. Thirdly, don't you think that it's vital that we have representatives from European parties rather than from national parties? We here are representing European sovereignty. I repeat, we represent European sovereignty, and as a result, we should all be subject to the same set of rules so as to ensure that we're working on equal footing here. We should be part of transnational lists where the lead candidate would be running to run Europe. That would appear to me to be democratic. My final question, which I direct to colleagues from the Green and GUI groups. Please, colleagues, don't vote against this. This is an imperfect law. It could be better. But I don't think that you should combine your forces with those who are so opposed to Europe.
Acceptez-vous, Mr. Járéki, do you accept a blue card on this? Mr. Le Breton has a blue card for you if you accept it. Go ahead, Mr. Le Breton. Thank you very much for granting me that blue card. I was struck listening to you to note that you no longer think we represent our peoples here. In the course of this electoral reform, you would like us to represent European political parties. Personally, I think that's a mistake. I think the last chance you have to save the European Union is to go back to the people. It's just advice from my part. I mean, I'm a partisan of dismantling the EU myself, but if you want to save it, I think you ought to reach out to the peoples. Isn't that your last hope?
Pero los pueblos.
The peoples of Europe are Europe. Acting together, they're Europe. I would like to see more European political parties. I don't simply want to aggregate national parties. I want genuine European parties which represent and symbolize European sovereignty. This is why this law hasn't got enough references to transnational lists and European parties. It's true, but this is a step in the right direction.
Monsieur Gericke.
Mr. Gericke, 1 minute.
Well, I would condemn the fact that the SPD and CDU in Germany are basically abusing this report to try and reintroduce a 3 to 5% hurdle, totally ignoring the German Constitutional Court sentence. I hope you're not afraid of the small parties. CDU colleagues, we have your, our eyes on you. Our voters appreciate that. Look at the asterisk principle. We're small, but we're brave. I've already dealt with more reports in my year here than many colleagues did over the last 10 years. I'm one of the busiest German members. I represent the concerns of our citizens in one of the largest constituencies in Germany because I try and support families' interests. Well, why are you afraid of taking on us asterisks? Stop ignoring the German Constitutional Court. Stop trying to tread on the interests of the small parties.
We now move to catch the eye. I have 6 requests, beginning with Mr. Pospíšil. 1 minute.
Est-ce que je l'ai mal dit?
Did I mispronounce your name, sir?
Paní předsedkyně, já jsem velmi pozorně poslouchal celou debatu. Souhlasím s návrhem, který předložili zpravodajové. Ten návrh má celou řadu pozitivních.
Well, thank you very much. I've been following the debate very closely and I support the proposal. I think it's a good idea to have online electronic votes, but I hope that this is actually going to succeed in Europe. Well, I hope this isn't going to increase the European dimension of the vote. I think that this needs to remain at the national level, because if we're forgetting the nation state, then we're breaking the link between citizens and politicians. Citizens should know their parliamentary representatives, they should speak the same language and be able to contact them. If we break down the national aspects of the system, then I think that we'll find ourselves in a situation where voters don't bother to turn out because they don't know their representatives.
With the revision of the electoral procedure, we try through the window to create the European demos. So, with the Amendment 1, it's defined that the members of the European Parliament are elected as representatives of the citizens of the Union and not as representatives of the people of the member states of the Union. But the European people cannot be abolished through law, and this should be understood by everybody. Furthermore, with the new electoral law, we impose a threshold of 3% in order to the distribution of the seats, excluding from the next European Parliament some movements and very annoying voices against German Europe. For the new electoral law, with the electoral law, we strengthen the European prevalence of the parties against the movements and the people. And the people are not the source of European legislation. So paragraph 21 of the report promotes the European melting pot, doubting the languages of the member states, and wants the recognition of the minority languages in the European elections. Thank you.
Mr. Haristi Abons.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, President. This reform is not going to bolster democratic reform of European institutions or the democratic legitimacy of the decision-making process of the Union, nor will it really attract our citizens anymore. It seems to me that we're giving, we're looking to regionalist political parties. Now we're talking about the Basque Country, which is a nation, a people without a nation of its own. And we are finding that millions of our citizens are going to feel squeezed out of the European democratic process in this way. Now, we need more legitimacy in my country, more European legitimacy, and if so, then you want to have a single constituency. Ms. Reda.
Thank you. I think this proposal is most definitely a missed opportunity. If we look at the current situation, practically all German MEPs would be willing to support practically any proposal for an EU electoral law so as to push through their threshold. In that case, I would say to the rapporteur, use this opportunity, come forward with an ambitious proposal, including transnational lists. We need to enhance the European dimension of EP elections, but you can't do this simply by printing the logo of a European party or by excluding small parties from the parliament. We can only enhance the European dimension by ensuring that MEPs from different countries really are encouraged to work together in pushing through joint political positions. That's something you could achieve in transnational lists. Under the present form, however, this proposal simply lacks ambition, and it's a fairly transparent attempt to eliminate small German parties from the European Parliament.
Mr. Polčák, please.
Děkuji, paní předsedkyně, za udělení slova. Thank
you very much, Madam President. Well, I must say I was rather surprised when I heard some of the comments today. The threshold has been mentioned quite a number of times. The German Constitutional Court came to the conclusion that the minimum threshold was unacceptable. I would respect that decision, but nevertheless, I can tell you that the Constitutional Court in the Czech Republic has also passed a sentence on that subject, and they decided to keep the threshold as it was not anti-constitutional. So you've got two different constitutional courts deciding in different directions. I think that that really shows up the problem we find ourselves in. The constitutional laws of individual EU member states have different rules, and I think that these kind of divisions are not a good thing. So I would be very cautious in setting up common rules.
Mr. Ferreira.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Well, let's have a look at the most recent events. You've got treaties being approved behind citizens' backs without any democratic scrutiny, without any referendums, or when referendums are held, the results are ignored whenever they're considered inconvenient. And when there are rules in place, they're subverted. As you've seen with the budgetary treaty, Mrs. Merkel justified that, saying that we need something to guarantee that even if governments change, the policies don't. So there's direct and open interference, illegitimate interference in the sovereign decisions of the peoples. Governments are chosen, policies are imposed, and democratically elected parliaments are ignored. I think that the anti-democratic nature of the EU is clear. The whole building is anti-democratic in its structure. There's no point changing the colour of the paint on the walls. But there are some very serious aspects to this report that increase the anti-democratic nature of the EU.
Madame CREČU. Ms. CREČU, we return to you.
Après la fin du Thank you very much. Thank you all for all your comments and for this very interesting debate. I wish to conclude by reiterating that the Commission fully supports the Parliament's efforts to adopt this timely and very ambitious proposal. In our opinion, to deliver a union of democratic change, we need to build on the concept of lead candidates. The success of Europe as a political project requires an efficient democratic system in which its citizens are fully engaged. Strengthening the link between the elections and of the representative of the citizens and the selection and election process of the head of the European Executive is a tangible demonstration of the impact of citizens' democratic participation on the EU decision-making process. I also, as I said in the beginning, I think it's very important to highlight the importance of quota or gender balance, which I was very supporting also as member of European Parliament. I think this proposal is a concrete way to create a new sense of engagement in the European construction and stimulate citizens to play a more active role in European democracy. As I said in the beginning, at this time is really crucial to build and contribute to the trust between citizens and European institutions. Thank you very much.
We come back to the rapporteurs. Ms. Hübner, 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you indeed very much. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank both those who were saying that we lack ambition and those who are saying that we are too ambitious, because basically we have those two groups here in the room. And to those who say that we lacked ambition with this report, I would like to say that sometimes in our work, and you all experience this, we want to have more people on board for the ideas we think are important for European citizens, and then of course our ambition goes down to the common level of ambition, and that's to a certain extent also explain why we couldn't do certain things. We couldn't do them also because we also have the procedures through the Council. We have to go with this proposal to the Council, and the Council can completely ignore also that comes from the treaty, ignore our our proposal. That's why we are trying to build something that would get through the whole system and that could take us a step forward in the evolution of the European Parliament right to decide on the procedure for its own electoral process. So that to a certain extent might explain the first group of comments. But for all those who say that we go too far, I would like to say that I totally, entirely disagree with you. And when you say that we are moving too far in the sense of taking the responsibility for issues which should belong to the national level, to the national sovereignty procedure, I would like to say that this proposal brings members of European Parliament closer to their voters, and this proposal I think also brings European citizens closer to Europe. So we are achieving, I think, through this proposal what is today the biggest weakness of European Union, which is this huge distance between the citizens and the European Union. So I hope that through all those discussions that we are having, that we had at the level of the committee, that we are having here, and we will continue to have in the Council, that as a result we will get something that maybe will be not a milestone, as Commissioner was nicely saying, but certainly that will take us forward on this path towards the right of European Parliament to decide upon its own electoral procedures, because as George Shepard was saying, we are probably the only parliament in the world that is not able to decide itself about the procedure. And the last thing about the threshold and the German Constitutional Tribunal, I hope Jo Leinen will explain it, but if I remember correctly, the Constitutional Tribunal said also that if there was a European law on the threshold, then it would be a different story. So that's why we are proposing a European law, so that we can avoid all the problems that we are having at national level with different interpretations of different courts, constitutional courts. In any case, thank you, colleagues, very much, and I hope that you will still have time to rethink how you are going to vote. Thank you.
Mr. Leinen, Rapporteur, has the floor.
Ja, ich bedanke mich auch.
I would also like to thank everybody who's contributed to this debate. Mr. Schöpflin stated that a minimum threshold is fair enough, but it shouldn't be too high. That's what we've tried to do. We looked at the situation in 26 member states. In all those states, de facto or de jure, there's a 3% threshold. There are, and for the 2 additional countries where there isn't a threshold, we proposed one. The fact is, that's the rule which prevails in the majority of EU member states. And such a rule exists, it's tried and tested, and people accept it. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the German Constitutional Court handed down this ruling. At the same time, it did actually open the door to a minimum threshold. It stated, as long as there is no standard European law, we rule on the situation in our country, as they did. They also stated that developments in the European Parliament must be followed closely when it comes to new powers and new responsibilities in electing a European executive. That's something we did with the election of the President of the Commission. And in the light of that, the court could change its position on the 0% clause. So I understand the fact that small parties aren't happy. At the same time, I don't think it's fair to portray such a one-sided picture. At the same time, I must say I also feel encouraged by those colleagues who said we should have gone far further. We looked at experience in the last period of Parliament, and we felt it was best to use a graduated approach, 2 phases. First of all, to do what we can now, and at a later stage we'll come forward with additional proposals which in all likelihood will be subject to a broad-ranging debate within a convention bringing together national parliaments and national governments. Let's be blunt about it. European lists will require changes to decision-making process, and as we all know, that will be very difficult to achieve, as we saw during the last Parliament. As the Commissioner, Mrs. CREČU, said, this is something of a milestone when measured against the decades of inactivity. As many people have said, this is a great step forward, and given that fact, I don't think that we should waste or miss this opportunity. If we were to do that, we would have lost the final window of opportunity for electoral reform during this Parliament, which means in 2019 we would continue within an electoral process which has proved to have serious shortcomings. I would add that I accept the fact that we're elected back at home in our countries, but when we're here in the European Parliament, we elect the we represent the European Union as a whole, not our member states. We're all aware of the fact that many members are Eurosceptics or anti-European. However hard we try, whatever we say, they'll never agree with us. They are a minority, and I hope it stays that way.
That concludes the debate. The vote will take place tomorrow. Now, the next item on the agenda is a recommendation for second reading of Antonio Marino Pinto's report on the Court of Justice of the European Union, number of judges at the General Court. The rapporteur, you have the floor. Please stick to speaking time.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The European Union Court of Justice in 2011 started off a legislative initiative to change its statutes so that it could nominate 12 extra judges for the General Court. In April 2014, this was supported by the Parliament in first reading. However, the Council never nominated any of those 12 judges because the member states didn't manage to come to an agreement on how those judges were to be chosen, because every single member state wanted to nominate its own judge. So the number of 12 judges didn't coincide with the number of member states, that's to say 28. So in 2014 the court asked for 28 new judges and the abolition of the Civil Service Tribunal. So, I'll remind you, the court asked for 12 years to try and resolve its supposed problems, but now we're asking for 28 new judges and the abolition of a court. Well, clearly this isn't an attempt to resolve the problems of the court, it's to try and resolve the problems of the Council that's not capable of nominating a number of judges that doesn't coincide with its number of members. So this isn't simply an amendment to the original legislative proposal. This is a totally new proposal, because we're not talking about 12 new judges, but 28 new judges, and abolishing the specialised court that's set up by the treaties of Nice and Lisbon. Now, the Commission needs to be consulted on the contents of this proposal, but this didn't take place. The Commission was consulted on nominating 12 new judges and not 28 new judges. It never produced any kind of opinion on the abolition of the Civil Service Tribunal. The treaties provide for the creation of specialised tribunals, but not for their abolition. So I'll remind you, this court was covered by the Nice and Lisbon treaties. Specialised justice is justice of greater quality. And it's possible to create new courts, perhaps for trademarks and patents, which would be a useful improvement rather than abolishing a useful court. Now, the Council and the Parliament should be informed of the costs and impacts